Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Courtney Callahan, a health scientist in the Center for Surveillance, Epidemiology, and Laboratory Services at the CDC. Welcome to the Laboratory Training and Services Branch webinar, Overview of the Rapid Toxic Screen and Laboratory Response Network for Chemical Threats, LRN-C. Today's event is being broadcast from the CDC Training Laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia. Today's webinar speaker is Dr. Rudolph Johnson. Dr. Rudolph Johnson is the Chief of the Emergency Response Branch at CDC's Division of Laboratory Sciences, National Center for Environmental Health. Dr. Johnson oversees the development of diagnostic methods for quantifying human exposure to chemical agents. Common chemical agents measured include traditional chemical warfare agents, such as mustard gases and nerve agents, as well as selected plant and marine toxins. Before assuming the role of branch chief in 2013, Dr. Johnson worked as a section chief and team leader for the Chemical Terrorism Methods Development Group for 10 years. Dr. Johnson also supervises emergency laboratory support for human exposure to chemical agents. ERB provides laboratory support to identify the causative chemical agent following a suspected human exposure and conducts the Division of Laboratory Sciences Rapid Toxic Screen. ERB maintains readiness through routine exercises, proficiency testing, and clinical laboratory improvement audits. ERB tests samples from a number of sources, including other federal partners and state public health departments. In addition, ERB works closely with CDC's Laboratory Response Network to develop diagnostic methods and to transfer these methods to other laboratories within the network. Dr. Johnson received his PhD in chemistry from Purdue University under Dr. Graham Cooks, an award-winning professor and researcher in mass spectrometry. His thesis was on the development on online mass spectrometry using membrane introduction mass spectrometry. Dr. Johnson received his undergraduate degree in laboratory robotics from Virginia Military Institute. Prior to working at CDC, Dr. Johnson worked at BASF Corporation, focusing on multidisciplinary projects involving small molecule synthesis and product development, specifically dispersions, coatings, and pharmaceutical products. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Rudolph Johnson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak this afternoon about the Rapid Toxic Screen and Laboratory Response Network. The network is across the entire United States and is a huge asset for the United States in the event of a chemical exposure for a large number of people. The Rapid Toxic Screen is something that's developed at the Chamblee campus in Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you who don't know, the CDC has 10 campuses in Atlanta, and I'm located at Chamblee, which is next to the Peachtree DeKalb Airport. I'll be talking today about the Emergency Response Branch, which has about 35 people in it, and we routinely work with the state lab partners who help us develop methods, implement methods, and respond to routine day-to-day issues. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. So I work in the National Center for Environmental Health. The CDC is the Centers for Disease Control, so there's multiple centers. The center I work in is the National Center for Environmental Health. And in the Center for Environmental Health, I'm in the Division of Laboratory Sciences, which has about 500 laboratorians who focus on providing laboratory support to improve the diagnosis, detection, treatment, and prevention of exposures of environmental, tobacco, nutritional, newborn, selected chronic, and selected infectious diseases. And the Division of Laboratory Sciences also improves the rapid and accurate detection and diagnosis of chemical threats and selected toxins. So most of the work I'll be talking about today focuses on chemical threat agents and toxins. I work in the Emergency Response Branch. There's three main facets of the Emergency Response Branch. One is the Emergency Response Team, which would actually deploy to collect samples. There are about 10 volunteers that are trained to get on CDC air transport and go to remote locations. Once the samples are returned to CDC, we have the Rapid Toxic Screen, which we measure 150 different chemical agents. It's actually much more than that now. Chemical agents in blood, urine, plasma, serum. And then if the number of samples we have is very large, we send samples out to the Laboratory Response Network, and those are our partner laboratories, which we rely on very heavily. For those of you who don't know the Laboratory Response Network, those labs are part of the state public health lab system. There's different levels of laboratories, which I'll be talking about shortly. So LRN-C has an important role in assessing exposures. One of the main things you need to do is identify the agent that someone's been exposed to, determine exposed and unexposed populations, provide retrospective analysis, In a lot of cases, someone may be exposed and you may not test for something until weeks later. So you need to have biomarker tests that you can use to test several weeks after exposure. So short-term biomarkers and long-term biomarkers. We have to be able to evaluate long-term health effects by providing laboratory support for that. And then we also have to determine who's been exposed on a geographical distribution. So I think you can all imagine if there's been a chemical exposure event, you want to make sure you can identify if you've been exposed and who has not. And that alleviates a lot of stress in the general public and also helps focused, unfortunately limited health resources towards the people who have been exposed. So laboratory plays a very important role. One of the big things I've learned over the years is that even though the laboratory may require a day or two to provide all the results needed during an exposure event, it is oftentimes the most reliable information provided that policymakers and responders can use to treat people. So what are we measuring in blood and urine? Well, typically if there's a toxic compound, it doesn't stick around very long. Oftentimes there's a resulting metabolite or a protein addict. So most of the diagnostic tests you'll hear about focus on metabolites and protein addicts. The metabolites don't stick around very long, and the protein addicts are the long-term biomarkers that you can use for retrospective analysis. Basically, the proteins are a carrier that have a biomarker on their back. The type of proteins we look at are red blood cells, acetylcholinesterase, and butyrylcholinesterase. And then the turnover rates, typically you'll have about 1 to 16% of those per day. So as you might imagine, if the biomarker is on the back of a protein and it's only around for 30 days, the time that you can monitor for that biomarker is 30 days. So diagnostic methods, what type of methods do we use? Well, basically these are reference level methods. They're typically isotopic dilution. We use the best internal standards you can. So if I were to sit down and say, what are the key factors associated with our methods that make them different than most other diagnostic tests like in the commercial laboratories? These are reference level methods. So they use isotopically labeled materials which have the exact same chemical properties but are heavier in mass. So that gives you the best accuracy and recovery possible during a diagnostic test. Most laboratories cannot afford those, so the CDC purchases those and shares those with the state public health laboratories. Also, we have to have very fast sample preparation. As you might imagine, we can't spend 2 or 3 days preparing a sample. It has to be done promptly for a large number of people if there's an incident. You really have to alleviate the stress of the people and focus your limited health resources to help them. Also, the sample preparation has to reduce interferences and suppression in the sample. As you know, clinical samples are very complex. You need to remove everything you're not interested in and focus on those biomarkers. Chromatography, everything we use is a gas chromatography or liquid chromatography. And then also the selectivity from the chromatography has to be different from your sample prep. So during your sample preparation, you might use reverse phase, hydrophobic interactions. Then you want to use something orthogonal to that when you're doing your chromatography. And then we use tandem mass spectrometry. So that's a big thing is all the state laboratories that are involved in the network have a capital investment in them to use tandem mass spectrometry. Typically, it's either GC, the GC is typically a single stage mass spectrometry, or liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry. And that's a really big deal because it's a capital investment, it's a reference level measurement, and the state labs are prepared to respond. One of the big things that I found over the years is that policymakers and decision makers don't understand that it usually takes about 2 to 3 years to set up a laboratory. It takes a long time. That means purchasing equipment, installing the equipment, characterizing it, and training the staff to use it. So all of these things together mean the LRN is a national resource that is prepared and has been developed over the last 14 years to respond to incidents of chemical exposures. Some of our general approaches, what are we looking for? Well, typically if we ask for samples to be shipped, the first thing I would suggest is you go to our website. If you look up the Laboratory Response Network, there's a website, talks about which samples we need and where to send it. And then of course, please keep in mind that you need to call the CDC first to make sure this is the right place to send it. Samples are received at the CDC from the state epidemiologist, not from individuals or hospitals. So methods are developed for urine. We also look at multiple blood products. So what's the big deal with multiple blood products? Why can't you just say, give me plasma, serum, or whole blood? Well, the reality is that if you have a chemical emergency, you have to be willing to work with whatever you can get. So your methods have to be robust and have to be able to apply to a wide variety of matrices. So blood can be plasma whole, can be lysed, it can be post-mortem, and also nested extraction procedures. The reality is that there's not enough sample to go around for all the testing that needs to be done. So being able to take a blood sample, remove the protein, and then look at the metabolites, and then maybe look at red blood cells. So 3 different extractions out of the same volume is a lot more efficient than giving a different aliquot to every single analyst. So the ability to test smaller and smaller samples means more data. Also more sensitive tests means you can measure longer post-exposure. So as you can imagine, it's very important to be prepared. Another area that we're developing, which has been around for a long time, is the use of dried matrix spots, so basically blood spots, which is used in newborn screening. One of the big issues there is that the sensitivity of the instruments, the tandem mass spectrometers, has been increasing over the years. Combined with the use of the internal standards we have means we can use less and less sample. So why use a blood spot? It's less sample. Well, the reality is that if a laboratory has an exposure event, they can put a blood spot on a piece of paper, dry it, and just mail it to us. And that alleviates many shipping concerns. So as an example, you could send something by FedEx as a blood spot for $10 to $15, versus if you have to ship it on a refrigerated container, that could be $100 to $200. And the big issue with the sensitivity of the instruments is we can use less and less sample. So I'm going to go through a few examples, some of the complexities associated with developing a test. So this is supposed to be a training opportunity. So I'd like to make sure you understand some of the considerations you have to take when you're developing a test. Nerve agents have been in the news quite a bit. So I was going to talk about organophosphorus nerve agents versus common pesticides. So in the case of nerve agents, you hear about sarin quite a bit and VX. Those are different from common OP pesticides because they have a phosphorus-carbon bond. So there is what's known as the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is administered by the OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And they have a list of compounds that are restricted that really you have no business having for any reason whatsoever. And so chemical weapons are some of those. You shouldn't have it in your house. You shouldn't have it in a country. It's not something you should have at all. So how do they restrict it? Well, you have to have a policymaker, an attorney, and a chemist all come together. So the chemists from the OPCW decided that all nerve agents have phosphorus-carbon bonds, and that's what differentiates them from useful commercial pesticides. So that's a big deal. That's what we're always looking for. So if you notice, sarin has a phosphorus-methyl bond, Tabin has actually has a phosphorus and then a cyano group, and VX has a phosphorus and a methyl group. Each one of the nerve agents also has a leaving group. So you'll notice sarin has fluorine. So when that reacts with the body, that produces an OH group. Also, it's the same degradation product in the environment. VX has the same thing, except it's the sulfur ligand that falls off. Okay, so that's nerve agents and the difference between that and commercial pesticides. It's a very important distinction. It's also useful to know that nerve agents originally were developed as pesticides, and then they discovered they were very toxic. So that's why they fell into a different category. Interesting thing about chemistry in general is there is a lot of history associated with it, commercial development, different countries. So if you like to learn things about history, chemistry does provide you with that opportunity. So nerve agents inhibit cholinesterase activity. One of the big issues is that cholinesterase is at your nerve junctions, and then it's acetylcholine is at your nerve junctions. Acetylcholinesterase reduces the acetylcholine. So what happens when you have a nerve agent exposure, the acetylcholinesterase itself, the thing that reduces the acetylcholine, is inhibited. So that means you get overstimulation of muscles and nerves, and that's what produces all the effects associated with a nerve agent exposure. So why would you measure butyrylcholinesterase versus acetylcholinesterase? And that's an important thing to measure, understand as well. So typically when you understand about nerve agent exposures, most people talk about acetylcholinesterase, and the fact is acetylcholinesterase is bound to red blood cells, and that is most closely tied to clinical symptoms. However, acetylcholinesterase is very difficult to extract, and butyrylcholinesterase is not. So butyrylcholinesterase is easy to extract, and there's more of it. So we use butyrylcholinesterase as your biomarker of interest. And then clinicians usually look for acetylcholinesterase, which is typically an activity type assay. So mass spectrometrists and clinical diagnostics focus on butyrylcholinesterase. Physicians usually want to know acetylcholinesterase activity to understand what's been inhibited. But when you look at acetylcholinesterase activity, it doesn't tell you what you've been exposed to. Have you been exposed to a commercial compound? Have you been exposed to a chemical weapon? So, but the big thing is that both are enzymes which bind opionase. Butyrylcholinesterase is also known as serum cholinesterase, much easier to extract, and it's also more sensitive. So when you remember, when someone's exposed to a nerve agent, it's inhibiting the acetylcholinesterase. That's what's mostly closely tied to the symptoms that you see, the overstimulation of junctions and so forth. Butyrylcholinesterase is not as closely tied, but it's easier to extract. Okay, so now that you've taken into consideration, I need to look in the body and measure a biomarker and determine a test that I can distribute to different laboratories. Now we have to look at the compound that you're measuring and how long does it stick around. When unfortunately, if you're looking at a protein adduct, butyrylcholinesterase has what's called an aging process. And aging has two big issues associated with it. One is your clinical diagnostics and the other one is treatment. And they're both closely interrelated. So what happens is when there is when there's an adduct and it starts to age, what happens is it dealkylates, which can happen in about 40 hours. Well, after that period of time, it's difficult to regenerate the original protein enzyme. And so as a result, what happens is treatment is not as effective. It's also very difficult to measure that aged product. So we spend a lot of time developing the ability to measure the initial protein adduct as well as the enzyme which is aged. So it's very difficult to do. And so traditionally, over time, when people have first measured nerve agent exposures, they've only been able to measure the protein adducts for a limited period of time, and then it disappears as it ages. CDC has actually developed diagnostic tests for both, which is very helpful. And then, as you can see in the bottom part of the figure, if you have treatment with 2-PAM, which is what you would give to a person, you actually regenerate the enzyme, but it has to be applied before aging occurs in the body. So again, the biomarkers have a certain lifetime. They're either excreted or they react in a certain way. Okay, so aging of the protein adducts varies with OP&A. So each nerve agent has, I call it, different personalities and different half-lives in the body. SOMAN, GD, ages promptly. Sarin is the one you hear about quite a bit, can take a few hours. Tabin is a long time, and VX takes a long time to age as well. So each one has a different purpose. I also want to make sure you know that protein adducts have a different role in their use in warfare. So sarin is an offensive weapon. So it's designed for dosing, and then that allows, it evaporates and allows people to occupy the area that's been contaminated, versus VX is a defensive weapon. It was developed originally for the Soviets so that if they were retreating across their land, they could treat the soil as a defensive measure, and then it's actually what most people do for termites in their house, not with VX, of course. And then what happens is people would track it up as they walk over it, and then they would be exposed and die. So the G series tend to be volatile, offensive weapons. V series are defensive weapons, and that's a helpful thing to understand as well. And then as you might imagine, if something's a defensive weapon, it's going to be more stable, which means it's not going to have as much aging in the body as well. So, but aging is a key public health issue. I just want to make sure you're, again, aware of it. It reduces treatment effectiveness and impacts many diagnostic tests around the world. Okay, so just to go through a few things in the body, sarin, when you're exposed to it, first thing that happens is you have hydrolysis in the body, and it's either excreted in urine or you can find it in the blood, and that's a phosphonic acid. For those of you who do environmental testing, this is the same biomarker that you look for in soil and water. If you have a protein adduct, we look at butyrylcholinesterase. We also look at albumin. So one of the big issues with butyrylcholinesterase, as we talked about, is the biomarker ages. The advantage of albumin, which is highly prevalent in the body, is that it does not age. So that biomarker is present for a long period of time. So a very interesting thing about looking at diagnostics in the body is that, and we haven't developed this fully yet, is the fact that if you have two protein biomarkers and you have a short-term exposure and a short-term measurement, both will be present. As time passes, the one that ages dissipates, and the one that does not sticks around. So you can look at the ratio of those two protein adducts to get a general sense of how long ago an exposure occurred. But we have not fully developed that yet, and that is one of the kinetics associated with it, is one of the big sort of development frontiers that we have. So if you have any suggestions on that, I would appreciate hearing about your ideas. So chlorine, I was going to talk about chlorine a little bit. One of the issues with chlorine is it's small. It's very difficult to find a protein adduct for chlorine, and we've recently developed that. It's on albumin, like we just talked about. It doesn't age, and chlorine is a big public health concern, and we've published that work recently. So OPCW classifies chlorine as an industrial compound, but it's also a choking agent depending on how you use. So it falls under dual use. Those of us in public health, you hear about dual use quite a bit. It does have a history of use in warfare. It was originally used in France, and then every year, believe it or not, there's a celebration of when it was first used. I guess a memorial is a better way of saying it, for that first use, and that's what started the entire chemical warfare arena. It's widely transported in every single state that's out there. We're all exposed to it on a routine basis. And the big issue with chlorine is it's readily available for people who want to use it as an offensive weapon. And there is no antidote to chlorine exposure. And the other thing about chlorine is, it's just to talk about, many people who are exposed to it require hospitalization. There are tons of it on the railways. I used to work in the chemical industry. We had large tanks of it. So chlorine is a big concern, and we have a diagnostic test for that now, which is related to the nerve agent diagnostics. So I want to talk a little bit about method validation and characterization. The reality is that if you're a scientist and you're working on developing a new method, you probably have a pretty good idea how to develop the method in a few days. And as long as you know you have a stable biomarker, you can develop a test. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit of time. Typical method validation is between a year and a half once you've established what your biomarker is. So one of the big issues is how stable is your biomarker in your matrix. So if you store reference materials and you put it in the freezer or you collect samples from a person, how long will it be stable in the matrix? What kind of recovery can you expect to get? How much of the biomarker in the body can you find? The other thing is that you have to have a quality control system. You have to be able to run the system day in and day out, and you have to have a quality system that can be evaluated for accuracy, precision, limits of detection, and you also have to look at a confirmation-I ratio for additional selectivity. Ruggedness and stability are a big deal, and system performance. So again, all of this comes together on your system, which has an isotopically labeled standard, which boosts your precision. Your chromatography system, your extraction, your tandem mass spectrometry, all requires a lot of maintenance. For those of you who don't work with these systems, it's typically on the order of about $30,000 a year for service contracts. It's about 10% of the value of the systems. So very capital intensive, very costly, but the results you get are the best available. So the rapid toxic screen, just to talk about that a little bit, we look at agent identification following an unknown exposure. So if you know what it is, we don't need to run all of these. But the rapid toxic screen is designed for looking at 150 different chemical agents in urine, serum, and whole blood. And we also look at radionuclides. Some of the areas that we look at are vesicants, those are your blistering agents. Traditionally sulfur mustard, nitrogen mustard, lewisite. And sometimes those are mixed together depending on where they come from. For those of you who don't know, Russia tends to have a mixture of sulfur mustard and lewisite because of the freezing temperatures there. And then actually adding lewisite into sulfur mustard helps reduce the freezing point of it. So that's very characteristic of a Russian munition. We look at cholinesterase inhibitors. We look at both pesticides and nerve agents. We look at toxic metals. The fact is arsenic, mercury, lead, those are all traditional poisons. We also look at cyanide, 45 laboratories that have that test. We look at volatile organic compounds. We look at rodenticides, rat poisons are readily available, and also new agents as they come out. You're always hearing about the newest poison that's in the news. Those are things that we are prepared to test for. Radionuclides, we look at alpha emitters, beta emitters, and gamma emitters, and then we also look at actinides with long half-lives. Okay, so the Chemical Emergency Response Team. This is Chris Pittman in the middle with Charity Sapp and Becky Shaner. So they're on the response team, and as part of the response organization, they support collection, tracking, and transport of samples to CDC. Just to make it very clear, if there's a chemical agent exposure and it's intentional in the United States, it will most likely be a legal issue. So chain of custody is critical to make sure that you maintain. Otherwise, your sample results are not valid. So it would be a big disappointment if we had the entire laboratory response network and we were not able to promptly respond and accurately report because we mixed up the samples. So the emergency response team promptly collects the samples and returns them and maintains chain of custody. I will tell you on a routine basis, though, I think we've all seen flight interruptions for a variety of reasons, software systems and other events that have occurred in the United States, and the sample collection from the state laboratories has played an important role over the last many years. In the Chemical Emergency Response Team on the right, we have two teams in case we have to deploy to two different locations. So the rapid toxic screen, this is Charity Sapp, and this is one of our robots that we have for aliquoting. It used to take 10 to 12 hours to aliquot 21 methods from 40 samples in different containers in different formats. We can do that in about an hour now. The main issue with aliquoting, the robot provides the chain of custody. We have barcodes that are on them. It tracks where every sample is, and we can promptly hand those out. So it takes 36 hours to measure all 150 agents in 40 samples. Again, vesicants, blistering agents, and nerve agents are your traditional chemical warfare agents that most people are concerned about, and you hear about that in the news quite a bit. So sulfur mustard, again, is a vesicant. Sarin is a cholinesterase inhibitor. So is VX. And sarin is known as GB. VX is just VX. There's no longer name associated with it. So making sure everything works. Again, chain of custody is a huge deal. Labeling, dry ice. If you have to send 5,000 samples somewhere, where do you find the dry ice for that? We've actually discovered a lot of grocery stores have it in case there's an emergency. But typically the laboratories stock that for sending samples. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner an example of the packaging needing to send out 5,000 samples. And we also make sure we assess capabilities, personnel, and transport. It's a big deal to be able to travel in the government, especially promptly, making sure laboratory resources are in place and that data approval and reporting is in place as well. The first rapid toxic screen I had many years ago, on the weekend we were reporting out and all of our printers were turned off. The issue in the government is a lot of buildings are energy efficient. So that means everything is turned off. Well, most emergencies in my experience are at nighttime. So the buildings are inherently dark. You have to figure out how to turn the lights on. And on the weekends, it's the same issue. The diagnostic tests we have are very robust, chemically sound, and the people are very well trained. Most of the problems we run into are things that would probably make you laugh. Why isn't Dunkin' Donuts open 24 hours near me? These are the kind of problems we run into, not the actual testing. We have some of the best laboratorians available both at CDC and in the state public health labs. So if we have a large number of samples, where do they go? Well, that's what the Laboratory Response Network was designed for. That's the primary purpose of it. The state public health labs in themselves are experts in their areas, but the reason why we invested in them for this purpose was for surge capacity testing. Also, the CDC, because we have training capability for our own laboratorians, we can switch over most of our equipment for testing in-house as well. So if there's a large exposure, we run the rapid toxic screen. Large number of samples are sent out to the state labs. And during that time, our own instruments are being turned over and tuned, and people are being trained to run more samples at the CDC. So we have a lot of depth and a lot of expertise. So I want to talk about a couple things that are a little more mundane that really make a difference in how the system works. CDC packaging and shipping exercises. The reality is that most of your safety issues and most of your integrity issues will occur during shipping. So we actually, along with being able to test for diagnostic biomarkers, we actually make all the laboratories prove that they know how to ship and provide to us all of their shipping and training documentation every year. So that is the most common exercise we have from every single laboratory 3 times a year. And the instructions for our shipping and receiving, you can see in the upper left there, that's how you send samples to CDC. So I would say, even though the instruments cost a lot of money and there's a big investment in training and the mass spectrometers and the isotopically labeled materials are so important, the reality is it's the simple, mundane things that will get you if you're not paying attention. Shipping and receiving are a big one. If your sample is not kept at temperature, if it's lost. We had several packages in an exercise once lost in the Midwest, and they kept temperature until they were found. So these types of things will really make or break your capability. Again, more pictures of samples being shipped out. So we also spend a lot of time with the packaging determining how long it will last. Typically 3 to 4 days. Beyond that, you start to have integrity issues. But again, we are equipped to measure samples in a variety of matrices depending on how they've been stored. So, and in just a moment, just to touch on a couple of issues, not to resolve them, I did want to make sure you understood that there's the sample stability. Once the sample is collected, how stable is it in matrix? There's also the issue of, what if a person passed away and you didn't find them until a week later? That is also a sample issue, integrity issue you need to take into account through your diagnostics. So LRN-C partner lab capabilities. We have 3 levels. Level 1 laboratories, the primary difference between level 1 and the rest of the laboratories is they have double capability for every test. 2 triple quads, 2 GC systems, 2 metals instruments, ICP-MS. State laboratories typically are focused on local response, and they have 1 system of each. And level 3 laboratories are focused on shipping and receiving and surveillance. So where are the labs? Well, if you look on the map to where you are, you'll notice we have 10 level 1 laboratories, 34 level 2, and 10 level 3 labs. And if you look at the color for where you're at, you can determine what level you're at. Level 1 laboratories are really a strong part of the network. I think, in my opinion, level 2 laboratories are the ones who receive a lot of work and a lot of day-to-day operations and don't get as much recognition for their effort. So a large part of what I do is making sure level 2 laboratories are reinforced. Level 1 laboratories have their funding, which I realize isn't part of this talk, but if you can't effectively fund your laboratories, it's a tough time to keep them running. So mostly what I do is focus on level 1, level 2, make sure they have appropriate funding, instrumentation, staffing, and training. We meet twice a year, and the state laboratories have a lot to share and a lot of experiences, as you've seen in the news, between all the poisonings for a variety of things. The first place a lot of responses go to are the state public health laboratories. I went to a laboratory in the south, it's actually the Texas State Public Health Laboratory, and I remember they had a loading dock that the general public could drive up to and just bring samples to. A lot of the state public health labs are like that. Could you imagine your laboratory accepting samples from almost anything? The type of expertise you need to have, the flexibility you need to have, the training you need to have. State laboratories are a very strong resource, and they should be appreciated, and they should be contacted when you have a question or a need. CDC has dedicated training and staff support. So this is a big deal in an emergency response. We routinely train the state laboratories, typically remotely because there are a lot of restrictions on travel now, just for budget reasons. So we focus on webinars like this one, or we also have CDs that we can provide to state labs for training. We also support vendor training whenever possible. I'm a big fan of people getting OEM training and then getting more specialized training on top of that. Some of the issues with transferring methods to other states, other federal partners, other countries, sometimes we train them as well. We have to consider taking on-site training, computer-based training or web-based training. I will tell you the one thing that was very disappointing in the last federal budget shutdown was the fact that the folks from England came here for training and then we closed the government as soon as they arrived. So there are a lot of other issues that go with training, but I just want to make sure you understand I think training is the backbone of the network because it builds expertise. We could never really expect the next emergency, so that training, that capability is really what lends itself to making sure the network is ready to go. So some of the challenges we have at the CDC to make sure all the labs are running properly are making sure we evaluate the participants, and the materials, PT, training, and validation. We have our national program. We also work with international collaborators at the OPCW and our internal proficiency testing program. I wanted to briefly touch on the OPCW and the issues associated with international collaborations. So again, the OPCW is the organization that runs the Chemical Weapons Convention. Most countries are signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and we travel there once a year after our biomedical proficiency test. We are currently a designated laboratory at CDC for international testing. We're currently going through the documentation process for that. There are 3 OPCW designated laboratories in the United States. One is at Edgewood, one is at Lawrence Livermore, and one is at the CDC. The other 2 do environmental sampling as well and testing. We only focus on biomedical. So one of the big issues with biomedical testing is it's one of the newer tests that's been developed through the OPCW, and we had to go through a series of confidence building exercises, took about 5 of those, and then we proceeded to move into a proficiency testing phase. During all of those phases, we got to participate by providing new tests and validation procedures that we were able to share with the OPCW. And some of the interesting things with sharing with international laboratories are what type of equipment do they have? When you go to an international laboratory, what's the most important thing they have? What type of support do they have? I remember the first time I went to a weapons laboratory in Europe, there was nothing in the laboratory. There was one instrument down the hallway, and the rest of it was all bench space and safety protocols. So each laboratory has a different focus, and international collaborations are quite challenging and also quite rewarding. Let's see. So what does the OPCW do? So if there's a challenge scenario, so this is an exercise scenario, but the way the OPCW works is that if there is an allegation of chemical weapons use, typically manufacturing is what they're focused on, then someone will challenge another country at the OPCW, and then inspectors will be sent. They show up with their metal containers with actually portable GCMS systems, and then they collect samples, test them there, and report the results back. And then if there are people involved, they will bring those samples back as well and distribute those to other collaborative laboratories such as ours. And the big difference between environmental and clinical is the environmental samples can be tested on site because that's the older of the 2 testing algorithms, and that equipment's been around a lot longer. Biomedical testing requires fixed laboratories and more sensitive tests. So again, the environmental samples, you're looking at much higher concentrations, ppm levels. You might see containers with labels on it. For people, you have to be looking at sub-part per million ranges, typically low part per billion, and that's the type of samples you're receiving. Chain of custody is very important as well. So key issues for biomedical testing. I wanted to make sure you understand that biomedical testing is not standardized for chemical weapons exposures. You need documented experience to establish your credibility. A laboratory takes years to set up. It also requires publications and external review. So we're CLIA audited to make sure that we have the best possible quality systems in place. I want to make sure I emphasize that one more time because oftentimes what I hear is, well, you have the equipment and you have the people, let's just move them and do something else, and we'll sort of forget about doing that testing for a while. It takes another few years to set it back up again, and that's a common misconception that laboratory testing can be simply turned off and restarted at need. Laboratory testing needs to be continually funded, reinforced with training, and you need to keep up with the expertise you can. The publications and external review are critical to establish your technical expertise. The other issue with the publications is That's how you talk to international collaborators. In case you didn't know, if you develop a diagnostic test in the government, you can't share it with another country directly unless you have an agreement through the Department of State. If you publish it, it's openly available and you can talk about it. So publications are also not only a credibility issue, but a communication tool, as you'd expect. Selective tests are very needed. If you have a chemical weapons exposure, you better be sure about your results. Someone is going to be very concerned if there's a sulfur mustard or a nerve agent exposure, especially in a major city. You have to make sure that you have multiple biomarkers. It's one of the reasons why I talked about sarin from a metabolite standpoint, an activity assay standpoint, biomarkers that degrade and biomarkers that don't. Having multiple, we call them fingerprints for an exposure, help gain your confidence so that you can accurately report and discuss the results with decision makers. The other issue is sensitivity of a test. The more sensitivity you have to have longer, you can have longer post-exposure monitoring. So the issue there, again, is when there's an exposure event, people are not always sure what happened. That's the big part of the rapid toxic screen. How do you investigate what happened? Well, what if you have to wait a week to get it back to someone to say, you know, we think it was something else, we want to check on it. If you don't have a highly sensitive method, you won't be able to detect those biomarkers. And that issue of sensitivity is what causes a lot of differences between laboratories. Someone who says, I see your publication, I'm just going to go set it up, the method, they won't have the same level of sensitivity as an established laboratory as in the case of an LRN lab. So in summary, biomedical testing is complex. There's a lot of issues to take into account. One, resources. It's expensive, it requires training. The next one is you have to identify your biomarker. What happens to the agent when it reaches your body, what it turns into, how long it sticks around. How can you get orthogonal testing to confirm something happened? Environmental testing typically has a point system associated with it, especially in Europe, where you take a very expensive piece of equipment and based on the different levels of extraction and chromatography and mass spectrometry, you have a value, a point system associated with that test. That doesn't apply in biomedical because in biomedical you really need to have additional orthogonal biomarkers to confirm something, not just simply a better instrument. So the OPCW had to go through a lot of growing pains associated with the differences between environmental and biomedical testing. And originally, a lot of tests for biomedical started in environmental labs and has given us a lot of headaches over the years. So you just want to make sure you know biomedical testing is complex. You need to have a maintained laboratory, and you need to have established expertise through publications. CDC and LRN-C are strong resources. There's a lot of expertise, a lot of capacity training, and we also receive external auditing to make sure we're the best at what we can be. Please turn to your LRN-C laboratories for assistance. They have a lot to offer, and they are very strong resources. Collaborations are key. We never have enough resources in place. Sharing the workload, focusing on different levels of expertise. These are key parts of getting science done, and honestly, it's the most rewarding part, finding people who have the expertise to solve a problem. Scientists, the fact is, you're problem solvers. That's what everyone likes to do. So you have to do that through collaborations. And I will tell you, we get a lot of additional emphasis on working with academics as well. The government recognizes that collaborations through academics allows us to receive the newest and most thoughtful ideas coming from the academic world. The government assumes those and then turns those into usable tests and shares those with other laboratories. State public health labs, research institutions, federal and international are key collaborators. International collaborators are big ones for us as well. In case you didn't know, after the Tokyo sarin incident, there was no test to prove a sarin exposure in the world. So what happened was most of the testing was done at the Dutch laboratories and the British laboratories. And since then, things have changed to the point that they actually draw on the role of the LRN-C. Those laboratories use the LRN-C as a role and the OPCW as well. And they also use the methods that we've developed. So a lot of things have changed over time, sharing of expertise and collaborations. And thank you for your time.
So we do have this question from Andrew McLemore. Where can urine shipping boxes be found?
Well, thank you for the question. The big thing I would say is it might be on our website. I'm not sure. But if you look up Uline, U-L-I-N-E, they have a website. You can look those up, but we're more than happy to help. On the CDC website, there is a direct contact to Charity Sapp, and she can give you that commercial information.